Great. Morning, everyone. Yeah, so I was gonna try to repurpose that bio of like, my name's Val and I'm kind of okay. I might even be awake right now, who knows? It's a fun time zone joke, never mind. The jokes will only get worse. That's the only way I can do them. But yeah, my name is Val Head. I do a lot of things around web animation, and I wanted to open up this morning with my favorite topic. Maybe it's your favorite topic too, but to talk about web animation, specifically about like what the heck we do because we have so many options of how to get things done. So you may have heard this phrase a bunch of times before. This is my favorite, it depends, because there's glittery, like, rainbow particles. But it still doesn't make this any more of an answer, right? You're like, this is the answer you get when you ask people, like, what technology option should I use for this thing I'm trying to do? And they'll be like, it depends. And you're like, thanks. Because it's, like, useful. You're like, that is accurate, but actually it's completely not helpful for me because I still have my question. And it depends is an answer that you get a lot when you ask things about web animation. So I want to dig into, this morning I want to dig into like what that means for web animation. Like what does it depend on? What depends? What's my real answer here? So that way the next time you end up like facing a question like this one, you'll have a better answer. So. It's like if you want to animate something on the web, you're like, do I use CSS? Do I use JavaScript? Do I use SVG? Do I use mystery option? I don't know. We will in a minute, though. So to answer this question best, we need to go enter the world of web animation. I don't know if you've ever seen a map of it before. It's quite cute. My favorite part is the WebGL mountains. I think those are pretty nice. Best place to visit. But you know, these are kind of our options in the world that we enter when we're like, all right, how am I going to do this stuff? So we're going to take a little tour of this world. I'm going to start with CSS Island because, well, it's like, I want to say it's one of my favorites, but it's my favorite partly because I'm kind of lazy. That wasn't in my bio, but it's true. Like if there's a simple solution that's gonna have like the least complications to it and I can get something done with like in the simplest way, I will do it. And CSS can often be that for web animation. A lot of times it gets kind of like, I don't know, it kind of gets put down for being so simple, but if that can be the answer to what you need, it's awesome to use a simpler solution. So, let's look at some CSS stuff. The things that CSS is particularly good at is anything with like well-defined states. If you know exactly where you're starting and exactly where you're going, whether that's an actual movement or like an opacity change or like anything that you're animating, because you generally have to have some change for it to animate. It's really great for that when you know both ends of the like where it's going, where it's coming from. It's really great for things like loading animations, things that need to loop. You'd be surprised how hard it is to make some things loop with animation libraries. CSS is just like, I got this. I will loop forever if you want me to, which of course everyone wants that. And anything on events that CSS has access to, like hover, focus, all of those things. CSS knows those. It's good with all of those things. Of course. Lists are good, but examples are better. So let's look at some examples of this. Hover animations, which can be fancy and even use things like blur filters and stuff. Pretty fancy, totally all done with CSS. Also like build-in or like appear-in animations. There's probably a good term for this that I can't remember right now. But if you want all your content to just kind of move into the page when your page loads, CSS is great for that. For this particular thing, I guess we're writing a giant essay. Not entirely sure what we do after it loads, but that's okay. Looping animations or little like animations that you want to have play over and over for a little bit or just very, like little notifications and stuff like this one. We have our little bell. It's very fun. You almost want to read your messages when it does that. You're like, that's cute. I'll read my messages. This is for like a banking dashboard, so it's probably like you owe us $1 bajillion, but I would still open that message. They're also really great for things like loaders. I would not recommend having like 8 on one page, but you can. Like you're really loading something in this case. Or it's just an example. Pick one, go with it. But CSS is great for all of these things because they're looping in little. And all of these examples have been really small so far as like taking up small amounts of the size of the entire screen real estate, but CSS can totally do things that are bigger too. Like really big full page navigation transitions. In pink. It's very important that they're pink for this to work. That's not true. Like I said, jokes only get worse. But like in this case, all of these things have those few things that CSS is really good at in common. You're like, for this one, you know that your navigation is coming from somewhere ahead of the screen in space. It's got an opacity of 0, and it's coming back to a position, like basically on the z-axis, and then becoming visible again. So you've got those two defined states. Even though it's really big and kind of 3D, CSS has totally got that covered. So some advantages of doing animation in CSS. You have no external libraries needed. And this is like one bullet point, but can be such a big one. Like if you have to have, if like page size is an issue at all in the projects that you're working on, or if like you have to have meetings if you want to include new JavaScript libraries, none of that has to happen if you use CSS, because it's just there. Like if you're making something for the web, you're probably already using CSS. I can't think of an exception to that, but if you know of one, let me know. But like CSS is just there, so you can just go put your animations in your existing CSS, and you don't like need anyone's permission. It's amazing. And you would also need to write a heck of a lot of CSS to make any real difference in the CSS file size. So it's pretty nice and light in that sense. It can also be great for designers who like aren't allowed to touch the JavaScript. You're like, I don't need to, I can animate in CSS. This is also how you animate in CSS. It's also how I code. I'm just like, hey. I'm fun to work with. It can be really great for performance with very little effort. There's a lot of performance sort of like freebies you get with CSS. That's not to say you can't get them with other options, but with CSS, they're just there and you don't even have to think about it. And you're like, thanks, CSS, that was nice of you. Keyframes are reusable, so if you're using CSS keyframes, you can use those on multiple objects in multiple places and just have this one set that you keep essentially replaying on different objects. It can be really great to make your animations modular. You can even like piece them together to create like fades and moves and all that kind of stuff. Pretty handy. And last but not least, you can adjust properties in media queries, which I guess is true for a lot of things, but it's really easy if you're already doing your animation in CSS to adjust things with media queries, especially if you're using something like custom properties or CSS variables, it can be easier. So, that's all the good stuff. But there are things that CSS can't do. It's amazing, but it's true. So some of the downsides of working with CSS. You have access to limited events. Like CSS knows when you're hovering on things, it knows when you're focusing on things, but it has no idea like where the actual coordinate space of where you're tapping or clicking is. It doesn't know gestures. It's CSS. It knows a lot, but there's a limit to its knowledge. You have to define these animations entirely ahead of time, which is easy if you know, like where it's coming from and where it's going, but like what if you don't? Like you can't write a CSS keyframe animation that's like, start from somewhere and maybe go somewhere. Like that doesn't really work out so well. You generally have to define them ahead of time. And we can be a little bit flexible with CSS variables or even like preprocessor variables, but there's like a limit to that flexibility. And currently, you can't separate the transform properties. That has little asterisks because if you are designing for people who use only Chrome Canary and turn on a very specific flag, if that is your audience and that is your entire audience, you can separate out properties because right now, Chrome Canary has them separated out. It's kind of like a thing that might happen. It's probably going to happen, who knows. But if you need to use any other browsers or your audience uses any other browsers, you can't. And if you do design only for people with a certain flag turned on in Chrome Canary, I'd like to talk to you about your audience, because that's crazy. That's so strange. So right now, transform is all one property, which means if you wanted to animate your scale, your rotation at different rates, that can get pretty complex. Not impossible, but maybe complex enough that it's not really a practical option. So, with that said, there's one other thing that can make CSS animation really powerful, and for some reason it's one that not a lot of people think about, and that is you can use CSS and JavaScript together. They're actually friends. I've talked to them both. They're cool with it. They like each other. And chances are, like, on whatever you're doing on the web right now, you're probably using CSS and JavaScript together to get stuff done. You can do it for animation too, and it can kind of extend the stuff that CSS can do, sort of using both for what they're best at and kind of take advantage of them working together. And you can make stuff like this once you combine the two. This is sort of like an explainer slideshow, I guess, for Stripe. And all of the animations, all the actual motion and fades and everything is done with CSS, but the timing of when they're fired is all taken care of by JavaScript. Because like CSS doesn't know how much time has passed, essentially. It doesn't know, like, it can't keep track of that sort of logic, but there's essentially like a JavaScript going on in the background being like, all right, we're at like 300 milliseconds, you go, now you go, and kind of choreographing the CSS animations. So they've got this nice balance of like best of both worlds kind of situation. It can also be good on smaller scale too for things like little menus. Like this one is on Dropbox. Nope, sorry, this is Medium, not Dropbox Paper, but like they look almost exactly the same sometimes. I don't know if anyone else has noticed that. I get confused, very easily confused, especially in the morning. But this is a Medium, and when you click on this icon, you get a little submenu that comes out, and it's the same idea, where they're using JavaScript for that click event, because CSS doesn't know if you're clicking on things. So when you click on it, JavaScript's like, go CSS, and that's basically what happens. So, to sum up CSS in general, the things where it's really, really best at is like animated interactions where you know your beginning and end state. They're very well defined, and you know them exactly ahead of time. Really simple interactive animations, which like, simple makes it sound like it's not like powerful, but if you think about like most of the UI animations we do and interfaces, it's like things scaling in or expanding or fading in or rotating. CSS is great for all of those things, and like it's like kind of the core of what we tend to do, at least in your like sort of like maybe base level UI animations, if you want to call it that. So the one things that, I guess the biggest pro of CSS is that you can get performance, like I said, for pretty cheap without having to think about it. You get a lot of performance wins, and there's no additional requests, which can make a big, really big deal. I've run into this many times in like my previous consulting time where like people were like, we want to get this done, but we literally can't add in any more libraries. How does this happen? Like that's a real issue that comes up more than maybe a bullet point lets it, gives it the power of. So the question I always get after talking about animating in CSS is pretty much this. It's like, hey, CSS is pretty cool, but like, how do I know when I should move to JavaScript? Like, oftentimes you'll hear advice like CSS is great for the simple stuff, but if you're doing complex things, you need JavaScript. And you're like, where is that line? Like, where is that? It depends. So I have three tips for that. If you're thinking like, do I need to use JavaScript? Is my animation complex enough that I require something more than CSS can do? Here's 3 ways to test it. I should have made this like a quiz. But anyways, if you're going to be chaining more than 3 animations together, JavaScript is going to make your life a heck of a lot easier. And it's not to say that you couldn't do like an entire like few-minute long animation in CSS. People do it. If you ever check out CodePen, people make amazing things with CSS on CodePen. But the things that are like great for a weekend experiment, not always great when you have like a budget or a deadline or teammates might have to edit your code later. They might be really mad at you if you make a 5-minute animation all in CSS. I guess it depends on how much you like your teammates. I should make a 4th bullet point like, do you like your coworkers? Anyways, to chain animations together in CSS, essentially what we do is like the first animation will have a duration, and the second animation will have a delay equal to the first animation's duration, and that's how they play one after the other. Totally cool when you have 2. When you have like 3 or more, let's say someone might ask you to edit that animation. Happens a lot. I don't think I've ever done a thing where someone's like, oh, what if it was faster? If you wanted to change that in CSS, you'd have to go back and change all the durations of the earlier animations, as well as all the delays of everything that follows, and then your life turns into a horrible puzzle, and it gets really confusing. So those kind of edits are way faster to make in JavaScript. If anything about the animation needs to change dynamically, like if you don't know where it's gonna end up, if you're like, oh, it's gonna animate to a wider size, but how much wider? You're like, well, that depends on like some user input or some amount of content or whatever. Those dynamic animations, sometimes CSS can be a little bit more rigid to work with, and it might make more sense to move to JavaScript because you'll have more flexibility. And if you need to animate your transform properties separately, pretty much every JavaScript library or animation library I've used, and even if you're doing it just like vanilla.js, you can change or access those properties separately, essentially because you do the math first, make a nice little matrix calculation, and then send that to CSS. So if you do need to separate out those properties, JavaScript gives you a lot more flexibility. With CSS, you have to like do all that thinking up front and kind of like meld them together in keyframes, and it's really not fun. It's like it's a giant puzzle. So for any of those things, if those apply, moving to JavaScript is going to be your better option. Which of course then means we get to go visit JavaScript Island. It's pretty fun. I like this one. Like I said, the mountains are great. Also the beach, vanilla JavaScript is like a beach of sorts. I don't know. It's great. It's fun when you can just invent maps and worlds. So the things that JavaScript is super best at are things like complex animated interactions, things that require more than just those fades or scales, or maybe they require like a bunch of things fading and scaling at once. Like complexity could mean the actual animation, what's happening, or the fact that there's many things that all are kind of dependent on each other. Complexity comes in many different flavors. Something that's more narrative or immersive, like we often think of CSS, or the way I like to think about it is like CSS is really great for those UI animations, those things that happen, on these kind of simple interactions. But there's a lot more we do on the web than just have like your basic interfaces. Sometimes you're trying to tell a story, sometimes you're trying to do some data viz, sometimes you're trying to like create an environment or a creative interaction of some kind, and like that's when JavaScript is going to be a lot better, or at least maybe a lot easier to get your job done. And any sort of dynamic state transitions, where if you're not sure where you're beginning or where you're ending, or that's going to change often, JavaScript can handle that much better than CSS and much more reliably. So some examples, of course. Some dynamic animations are things like the stripe menu, where all of these use a really similar animation. They're all like when you hover over it, the thing grows, but like some of them are longer, some of them are wider, so that's dynamic in that sense. And then like what if someone came along and was like, actually, you know what? Support also needs a drop down. The fact that they made this in JavaScript means that's probably going to be like a very simple change. If you did this in CSS, not that it's not possible, there's actually at least one CodePen redoing this in CSS. But if you compare them really closely, like it looks really similar, but it's just not going to be as flexible. If you had to add like a menu item to make one of those menus bigger or add another drop down, it's going to be a lot more complex. And also, again, if you don't like your coworkers, they might have fun getting through your code. So also any sort of drag and drop animations. This is a super fancy one, but it essentially is just like dragging and dropping. This one is all about like how much free time you have or where you like to stand in line. So all the dragging and dropping, and also things like where that modal comes in, it has sort of like a multiple bounce kind of easing. Like it's not just like one overshoot and done. It's like bounce, bounce. Those kinds of easing as well is easier in JavaScript because you have access to different kinds of math, essentially. CSS can do cubic Beziers. It does them really well. Those are great. But there's other kinds of easing out there, and CSS can't do them, at least not yet. I feel like with the web, it's like one of those things that you almost can't ever say, like, no, it doesn't do that, because like maybe tomorrow there will be an update and it does. You're just never sure. Also, anything where multiple elements have to work off the same input. For example, if you were making a 3D cube lion and all of his like face parts and body parts all like change their position based on where your cursor is because your cursor is a fan. He's the best, he's so cute. But even in cases where you're not making a 3D animal, if you have multiple objects that need to respond to the same input, it's gonna be a heck of a lot easier to keep track of that with JavaScript. And lions are cute. Or I guess no one thinks lions are cute. Oh no. Well, the rest of my slides are just, there's just lions on all of them. That's not true. JavaScript can also be really useful when you have this kind of sense of like a common timeline. Like when you have a series of actions that you're almost like, kind of packaging together and applying them over and over to multiple different objects. You're just kind of taking this like kind of like pre-made animation in a way, and then you're just pointing it at different places. Like this kind of carousel of work from this agency where they have very similar transitions, the same transitions happening, but on different content and of different lengths. So every time this transition happens, like those little like symbols turn into the new title, then the photo does its slicing thing, and then the paragraph comes in. Similar motion, like a timeline of motion, if you will, assigned to different actors or different objects each time around. Going to be a heck of a lot easier than JavaScript. If someone came in and asked these people, like, we need to add 50 more projects, they'd just be like, boop, 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 done. And this would just go on forever. I like the little garbled one, though. So, of course, we get one level deeper into it depends if we're like, all right, I have complex animations, I have dynamic states, I want to make a lion, whatever that is. Like, I need JavaScript. Then the question is, we get like one level deeper in our it depends, and we're like, do you want to use a library or like some sort of engine, or do you want to use like vanilla JavaScript? Which I've conveniently illustrated with ice cream, some vanilla JavaScript, or some kind of library. And it's like not that, like both of these are perfectly acceptable desserts. Like actually I would even have them for breakfast right now. I don't know what time it is, it's ice cream time. Sometimes you want like a basic vanilla cone and sometimes you want fancy ice cream. There's really no like always exactly the same. Like, there's no answer that you're like, that is right and the other one is wrong. So let's look at the vanilla JavaScript options first. And if you're going to be using vanilla JavaScript to do your animation, you're going to use request animation frame, unless you like hate performance. I don't know. I can't think of a good reason why you wouldn't. So that's what we're going to go with. And when you use request animation frame, you can get kind of a lot done. So I'm going to look at a really basic one, where if you wanted to have something happen with a request animation frame, basically animate that way, you kind of function. In this case, a function called moveCat. You'll never guess what this does. I'll give you 3 guesses. And somewhere in that function, you're going to like update, do some math to give your cat a new value. Like essentially, if we wanted to move a cat from like the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen, what we would do every frame would be like, do some math to come up with a new value for its new position. Because essentially, we're going to move it forward a little bit each frame. Then we'll add that change in position to its current position, which we'll do with that like little style transform. Ooh, I have highlights, I forgot. We'll do some math to get a new value. And then we'll add that value to wherever it is. So we're just adding a value with every frame. Then there'll be some more code. That's that ... And then we're just like, hey, browser, run this on every frame if you don't mind. And then the way request animation frame is really handy is the browser kind of manages like how fast of a frame rate it can get. It will do nice things like, slow things down if the device is not capable enough or doesn't have enough, enough processing power. It'll even like pause it if you have the tabs on in focus. Really great things. And then, of course, you have to actually call the function. I should have had a highlight for this one. I'm sure you never make this mistake, but sometimes you write a function and then you don't call it and nothing happens. But you would never do that. I've never done it either. Anyways, if we take that, request animation frame is highlighted. If we take that code, add just a little bit of conditions to like tell the cat to stop, and add some really variable names, essentially what we end up getting is this. Pretty cool, huh? Yeah, our space cat moves from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen, or the left side of space to the right side of space. That's how they keep track of where space is. Like, we're sending a satellite to the right side of space. No? All right. I guess you guys don't do a lot of space. Anyways, that's pretty awesome for like getting a cat from left to right, right? Like we've had to do a little bit of conditionals to be like, tell it when to stop or else it would go on forever. But it could get complicated really fast, right? Like that was easy, but what if we wanted to have like 5 cats? Maybe not so hard. What if we wanted the cat to like go back later? Or what if we wanted the cat to like have some sort of easing besides linear easing? If you notice that cat went across the screen at a constant rate and then just stopped. Kind of realistic for space because there's no gravity or friction or all those annoying things we have in the world. But if you wanted something to look more realistic, and he was like on Earth and not in space, he would probably like speed up into his action or like slow down before he stopped instead of just hitting a space wall. And that becomes a little bit more complicated too, because we'd have to do different math to update his position on every frame. And it would even have to be like math using like exponents or like trig or something. So it can get a little more complicated. So doing it yourself, doing your own vanilla JavaScript is really great if you're doing like just 1 or 2 things and they're fairly simple. Beyond that, it starts becoming, you start getting to realize why it is JavaScript animation libraries exist. But the main reason I wanted to show you this, well actually there's 2 reasons. 1, SpaceCat is really cute. And 2, any JavaScript animation library you're using really is going to boil down to some request animation frame situation like we just made, but in a more complex way. So it's not so different in that sense. It's just kind of giving you some shortcuts to make things easier for you, but really in the end, it's going to end up as request animation frame stuff too. So let's look at some libraries, or the sundaes, in case you forgot my dessert metaphor. Feels good to remind people of the dessert metaphor. Ice cream is great. So there's so many JavaScript animation libraries out there. There's like everything from like something that's just going to be a little collection of like easing functions for you. Like you can get one, I forget the name of it right now, but there's probably multiple that are just like a bunch of easing functions you could call in your own request animation frame animation. And there's other, like this gamut goes all the way to like ones that will basically do everything for you and have all sorts of features for all sorts of anything you could think of you might want to do with animation and like everything in between. So there's a ton of options out there, and there's really like not one that is always, like there's not one that's like always the best. It's really another it depends. It's like there's a theme for this morning. So I realized I could just tell you to use the one I always use, but I actually don't always use the same one. I do have a favorite. I thought it might make more sense to actually kind of walk you through how I would compare animation libraries for a particular project. So like if you came up to me today and you were like, hey Val, I want to animate a thing, and it's going to be dynamic and complex, so I need JavaScript. And also I want you to make it for me, and pick a JavaScript library you would use. If that was the question, here's how I would kind of narrow this down. So I decided I would start with making a short list first of like 3 that I would look into, because there's so many you can't look into every single one of them. At first I thought I would go to like one of those JavaScript usage statistics sites and just find out the top 3 animation libraries. Sounds like a good plan, right? Well, a lot of those use like historical data since the beginning of the web, or like even like the last 5 years. So the top animation library on all of those, animation library, is jQuery, which don't do that. Unless you hate your coworkers. No. Yeah, like jQuery does do animation, but is really not, I guess, dynamic enough or whatever to really do great interactive animation. It gets a little complex. So that kind of ruined that theory, because everything was just like, use jQuery, and I'm like, I'm not going to tell people to use jQuery because I've tried it and it's not fun. So instead I decided to go through and make a short list of animation libraries, or animation engines, if you will, that I've heard a lot about, or that seem to come up pretty often. So the first one I wanted to put on the list was Green Sock. Partly because their logo does have one green sock, which is really cool. It's actually kind of silly. But they're one that's been around for a really long time. I've seen people use them a lot on CodePen. They seem to have a lot of features, and it seems to get updated really consistently, so that's great, because I like it when the code I'm using isn't like super old and broken. Second one on my list would be Velocity.js in this case, because that's another one I've heard people using a lot. It's been around for a while. Maybe hear about it less now, but still, it seems like it's a pretty solid one to look at. And then the last one I put on my list to make a nice round number of 3 would be Anime.js, and mostly because I see Mary Lou using it on CodeDrops for all of her cool demos on CodeDrops. So if it can do the cool stuff that she does there, I bet it can probably do stuff that I need too. That's literally why it's on the list. I was just like, it looks cool when Mary Lou uses it, but hey, good enough. Like, you gotta narrow down your options somehow. So let's look at some of the things you might want to compare between the 2 in a nice fancy chart. Oh wait, no chart yet. First, I want to show you the secret of all these animation libraries that none of them tell you. All of them on their own sites will tell you they are the most performant and the most bestest at all animation things. Not everyone can be the best, right? Like, that's not possible. So that's one reason to compare them. But there's also a thing that they all have in common. Like, learning one doesn't mean that the next one is going to be so different. If you know one of them, if you can use one of them, it's fairly easy to apply it to other ones too. So they all have a very similar structure to their code. So if I was going to use Green Sock, which maybe that was first on my list, if I wanted to animate a thing, I would just be like, hey, tween max, because Green Sock has 3 names. That's really the most complex part of it. I would be like, hey, take this box and over 1 second, change the opacity to half of what it would be, move it 800 units to the right, and ease that stuff with some power to easing. Thanks, bye. And it would do exactly that. If I wanted to make that same amazing sounding animation, doesn't it? You're like, fade it and move it 800 pixels? Oh, best effect! You are all welcome to steal this animation and use it in all of your projects. No one's going to? That's weird. Huh. Anyways, if I was going to do that same amazing animation with Velocity, I'd just be like, hey, Velocity, take this box, change it, cut its opacity in half, move it 800 pixels, use a duration of 1,000 milliseconds, which is the same as 1 second, and ease and quad that stuff. Are you seeing a pattern here? Kind of, sort of. If I want to do that same thing in Anime, since I showed you 3 possible libraries, you'd be like, hey, Anime, take this box. You know where this is going, right? Make the opacity half, move it 800 pixels, take 1 second to do it, and ease that in with some easing quad. And really the biggest difference here is Green Sock calls the Penner easing equation of easing quad power to easing. The rest of it's all just where you put the commas and semicolons. Some of them, some of it's translate X, they're all really, really similar. And if you've done any CSS animation, you'll notice this is really similar to that too. You have a thing that you're moving, you have properties that you're changing, and you have some sort of duration applied to it and some kind of easing. Really, really similar. So I like to point that out just to show that there is a big similarity between them all. You can actually change from one to the other if one is better for your project, which I've totally done. So. Now to the amazing chart. I just like charts so much, I couldn't wait to get to this part. So some things we would compare now that we know what's similar about them. Maybe we'd look at file size. GreenSock is anywhere from like 9 to like 30-ish kilobytes gzipped. They have like kind of multiple components you can sort of pick and choose from depending on what you want to do and what you want to get done. Velocity only has one version, well, it mostly just has one version of itself, which is like 14K. And Anime is like super, super tiny. There's only one version of Anime and it's like 4.7 kilobytes. And you're like, all right, that's already a big difference, right? Like, it's already quite a variety of things. Might also look at browser support. GreenSock can support things all the way to IE8. Anyone still have to support IE8? Really? None? Oh, a couple of you, okay. It's okay, it's fine. It's still out there, it's a thing. Velocity, also back to IE8. You're like, I see a trend here. And then Anime's like, IE10. And if you're wondering why, in case you're like at some sort of JavaScript trivia night or browser trivia night, I don't know. The reason is that IE10 is the first IE to support request animation frame, like how we made SpaceCat. So all of these libraries kind of boil down to request animation frame, but both Velocity and GreenSock are doing something else to even have a fallback for that request animation frame, probably some sort of set interval situation. But yeah, so now you're already starting to see like why there's such a big difference in file size. I also like to look at where I can go for help because I don't know about you, but sometimes I write code and it doesn't work the first time or the second time, and I'm like, ugh, crap. So GreenSock has some great some documentation and some really great forums where people ask a lot of questions. It's been going on for years. There's lots of things you can look up and lots of like community support. Velocity also has documentation, and there's a lot of questions about Velocity on Stack Overflow. They don't have their own forum, but it comes up a lot on Stack Overflow. Again, also been around for a while, so there's quite a backlog collection there. Anime, on the other hand, since it's newer, doesn't have its own forum. There's a few you might find on Stack Overflow occasionally, but there's not a lot of that Q&A already existing, so it's mostly in their documentation. Conveniently, of the three, they also have the best documentation. I don't know what it is about like so many libraries, like just documentation is hard to do well, so they've done it well. So that's one other thing to look at. And then I might also look at like specialty features, because this decision is really going to depend a lot on what it is you're making, what your animation requires. So GreenSock has some very specific features around SVG. It has like plugins like Draw SVG, Morph SVG, and Draggable. So if you're doing like some heavy SVG stuff, maybe you want to use GreenSock. Velocity has it's a drop-in replacement for jQuery. So like if you your whole team is using jQuery, you're all really used to it, you can just like put Velocity in there and keep writing it like it's jQuery and it's fine. That's actually one of the big advantages of Velocity. There's like literally nothing new to learn. And Anime, I think its biggest thing is like it's very lightweight. Like it's so lightweight, it's very, very tiny. One last thing I might look at is licensing. So GreenSock is mostly open source, but they do have some features that require to be paid for and some that require licensing, or one particular case that requires licensing. Velocity has MIT license, you can do whatever you want, and so does Anime. So that's kind of like the one last thing I would look at before choosing one. One thing that's not on this list that would also be useful is actually doing your own performance test. Like I said, they all say they're the most performant, but that's clearly not possible. A lot of it depends on what kind of animation you're doing. So actually, I had a project come up recently where I actually had to go through this, where I was like, hey, we wanted to create this animation. We realized it needed like two very specific things. We needed to do an SVG stroke animation, which is possible in all of these things as well as CSS. We needed to demonstrate cubic Bezier easing, which is possible at least in two of these. I've just never checked the third, and also in CSS. And then we also needed to move an object, like as a child object of the SVG. So we realized pretty quickly that using CSS would be difficult because IE support for transforms on SVG child elements, not so great on Edge either. We originally thought we're doing SVG, we'll go to GreenSock. So we put together like a quick GreenSock just like kind of example to make sure it would work. And we're like, this is great, but we had to use some special features and we had to load in like almost all of GreenSock to make this work. We're like, it's only 3 illustrations. I don't know, like that could work, but can we really justify like this entire library for 3 tiny illustrations? And we're like, maybe not. So then we looked at Anime, which does all of those things, is a whole lot smaller, and we were able to get the same thing done, even though it was using a different tool than I might normally use. So we kind of did that balance of like what we needed to accomplish in file size, and that's how we made that decision. So JavaScript. Really, really good at things that are more complex, animations with dynamic states, and anything that's like immersive, where you're getting to more of this timeline, storytelling, data viz. JavaScript just has so much more power when it comes to logic to get that done. And its biggest advantage, I think, is that all of those animation libraries, even like doing your own request animation frame thing, you can apply that to like DOM elements, SVG elements. You can apply that to Canvas. Like JavaScript can get its little hands on everything. It's really just a matter of like the level of complexity, but it really can do all of those things. So JavaScript, not bad. So let's look at our one more island, which is SVG Island. Doesn't have any mountains, but it does have rocks. And SVG is one of those ones that's like, it's almost misleading to think of like CSS, JavaScript, and SVG as 3 options, because if you need SVG, you either use CSS or JavaScript to actually animate it. I should have made that a spoiler alert, sorry. My favorite thing about SVG is like, this is some dogs, this is the same 3 dogs, this is them, also them. It's like drawing stuff, even cute dogs, with math. It's so amazing. What makes SVG so light and powerful too, it's literally just like describing shapes with math. That's why SVG files are so tiny, because they're just like text describing vector points and curves and everything. So I love that about them. But more specifically when it comes to animation, besides just using dogs, we can use them they're really great at animated illustrations, also animated icons. Depending on who you ask, those are the same thing or 2 very different things. We won't get into that. Anything that's like infographics or data viz, SVG can be great at because it's just like these mathy bits of visual objects. Anything that needs to fluidly scale or be like responsive and then just like literally be any size. SVGs being vector, they don't care what size you want them to be. They're just like, I need to be tiny? Okay, I need to be giant? Sure, whatever, got this. They're so flexible and agreeable. So that makes them great for things like these bustle flowcharts, where this is actually one big SVG, and they actually just sort of animate the view, like literally the view box, or like kind of the camera that you're looking through on it. So like, let's zoom into this bit. And then as you move through, they just kind of move the little box you're viewing through. But the fact that it's all one SVG means they can make this be like a giant full page thing. They make it be like a tiny half screen thing. They can make it any size they want. It's nice and contained and portable, and they can put it in all these places. SVG is also really great for logo animations. Like literally, if anyone's talking about animating a logo, you probably want to do it in SVG. Like I can think of almost no exceptions to that. Chris Gannon does a lot of really great ones, like this one, where it's like this lovely draw-on effect and kind of fill-in thing. SVG is great for this, and this file size is going to be super, super tiny. It's always going to be crisp, and no one wants their logo to be blurry. It's also great for any sort of shape morphing. For example, hamburger menus. This is another Chris Gannon example. And I feel like this one brings up a really big question for our industry. Like, why not the pizza menu? Why did we go with hamburger? Who made that call? I like pizza better. Anyways, greatly disappointed. But anything in making one shape or like 3 lines into a different shape, SVG is like, got that. Anything that involves like these more illustrative things, like more kind of storytelling. This is a onboarding situation, or an onboarding flow really, where there's like these little walking characters. It moves into like this growing city. And all these are like SVGs that are animated. Each step has its own. It's kind of creating this nice, fluid, beautiful animation. All contained because they're an SVG. And of course, anytime you want things that look like straight lines to be not straight lines, SVG is also really great at that. Anything like bubbly and morphy and whatever else, like those lines, SVG is like totally got it, because it's just vectors, just math describing shapes. So, our it depends gets one level deeper with SVG, because there's actually 3 ways to animate stuff with SVG. Not 2, no, 3. Why would we have 1 option? Nope. More decisions! So there's 3 ways to animate an SVG. The first one, the most sort of like historically been around for the longest time one, is Smile, or SMIL. I don't know why it's pronounced Smile because there's no E, but whatever. It's kind of like, if you ever open up an SVG and there's a tag that says like animation or animate, that's Smile. It's like actual tags in the SVG to describe animation. SVG is just a magical like box of things. Unfortunately though, there is no IE or Edge support, and there likely never ever will be. So if you need to make things work on IE or Edge, it's not really a great idea. And then as if that wasn't bad enough, it's kind of being deprecated in Chrome. Like, it's not, they've paused the deprecation to some extent, but like at some point it is not going to exist and not be something you can use. If you do use it, you get a little warning in your console like, hey, we're deprecating this. So maybe like, if you already know it, that's cool. I don't know if this would be a good time to learn it if you want it to work in many browsers. We can also animate SVG with CSS, which like, you saw how complicated that SVG was with the dogs, right? CSS can animate that stuff. Go CSS. None of you were impressed by that. All right, whatever. I was like, yay, CSS. You used to just be able to underline links, and now you can like dig into SVGs and make stuff happen? Oh, amazing. So we can use things like transitions and keyframes of CSS on SVG elements, even the SVG child elements. There is a limited list of properties that CSS has access to. This is because SVG in its current implementation only reveals certain properties to CSS. CSS can't just like go dig in and take whatever it wants. It can only use what's revealed to it, which is generally things around fill and stroke and those sorts of things. Currently, transforms of child SVG elements, so those inner elements, is not supported in IE or Edge. There is totally one of those like bug request things for Edge where you can vote that up and be like, hey, we want this. I hear there might be someone here today on the Edge team. You can harass him about that if you want. So CSS, pretty good option for like things that are more like small icons, small things. This kinds of things that kind of fall on that scale of progressive enhancement where like if you were viewing this in Edge and you didn't see the animation, you wouldn't be missing any critical or important content. Also really great for small amounts of animation where you're like, I'm literally animating one icon, pulling in a whole library for this is a little bit overkill. Of course, our third option is JavaScript. What can't JavaScript do? Literally nothing, it can do everything. It can access pretty much all the SVG shop properties, or really all of them, because JavaScript can just kind of go in and actually get to those attributes. It doesn't have to have SVG reveal it to them. You can do pretty much, you actually can do everything that you could do in Smile. You can do things like motion along a path, shape morphing, all of those things are possible in JavaScript. The ease of how possible they are really depends on which library you're using. Some of them are very well suited for SVG morphing and making things move along an SVG path. Some of them not so much. One of those things to investigate when you make your own fancy chart. So JavaScript is probably the most powerful one right now. If you need to get a lot of things happening in SVG, JavaScript is going to be your best option. And one thing I want to point out about SVG, if you look at the browser support of SVG, these browsers that can like display SVG and support SVG. It's all green. All that is green. For some reason, there seems to be this misconception that like browsers don't support SVG, but that's really not true. They all do. So when it comes to animating SVG, the thing that's going to affect your browser support isn't the SVG itself, but the technology you use to animate that SVG. So those exceptions in different browser support are around the Smile, CSS, and JavaScript, not around the SVG, because it's literally all the green. It's amazing. Like, go SVG, right? If you are like, hey, that SVG stuff you showed at the beginning was very visual, but then the rest of it was all like code stuff. I like visual things. There are also tools to work with SVGs more visually. There is a library called which is now called Lottie Web, which allows you to actually export like shape layer animations from After Effects to SVG, kind of handy. So you can actually use your visual timeline and make it go on the web. And then Lottie proper, I guess I'm not sure how to refer to it now that there's two things under Lottie, can export these animations and help you play them essentially, or really do play them on things like iOS, Android, and React Native. So you can take these animations you made in After Effects, export them to all these places. There's even a helpful site called Lottie Files. If you're like, that sounds like crazy magic. How does it happen? You can actually go dig into other people's Lottie files and see how it all works, try them out for yourself, and all that kind of thing. Plus, it's just really fun to have an entire page of other people's animations. Just be like, do I like that one? I don't know, maybe I like this one. So, the things that SVG is super, super awesomest at, like I said, any sort of animated illustration, anything vector, SVG is like your best shot for that. Anything involving shape morphing, motion along a path, SVG, since it is like literally mathy paths, really, really good at that. And that's the technical term. They're like, which mathy path are we using? It's not. No one calls it that. But we could start a trend. No? All right. One person is in that with me. That's okay. And its biggest pro, the biggest advantage of using SVG is it's responsive by nature. It's super fluid. It'll go to any size, big, small, tiny, ginormous, doesn't matter. And there's potential for very tiny file sizes. Even some of the most complex SVG animation, like illustrations that are animations I've worked on, are really small files, because that's all just vector. It's all just math. So these can be really, 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 really tiny, if you want them to be. Well, I mean, they are. Yeah, so. I wanted to end on just really quickly a short look at the performance differences between these two. I don't know if you noticed, but performance was the water that all the islands were in. Good metaphor, right? Yeah. Slowly, yeah, no, I thought it was good. So CSS. Performance-wise, it's declarative. We put out that whole animation ahead of time. It's entirely you've basically written out the animation ahead of time. It's in your CSS. There's no question as to what's going to happen, which helps make it very performant in that sense, because the browser knows what's going to happen essentially for the animation before it even happens. When you're using transforms, you can essentially, in many cases, almost all cases really, do that off the main thread of JavaScript. So if you have really expensive JavaScript logic happening, your CSS animations are I don't care, I'm still spinning, yay. They actually say that, it's really weird. They don't. Or do they? I don't know. JavaScript, it's more imperative, so the browser's really only aware of one frame at a time. If you remember back to SpaceCat, we told the browser how to change on every frame, right? And that's kind of all it knew. We're add 4 pixels, add 4 pixels, add 4 pixels. We are very repetitive, that could be more complex, but that's essentially all it knows about. You can get hardware acceleration for JavaScript animation, but it's not going to be there by default. You actually have to ask for it, almost literally be hardware accelerate this. Most animation libraries actually have that built in. Some of them don't. If you're doing it on your own, you do have to kind of force that. So it's not that it's not possible, it's just that you have to ask for it. Occasionally I read stuff articles that are you can't get good performance with JavaScript. It's you just need to ask it to it's cool, you can do it. You just need to, just do a little bit of extra work for that. SVG. All browsers support hardware acceleration on SVG. They are super small file size though, so you often don't notice a huge performance impact. But the one place you might notice it is if you're doing anything with a lot of objects, like data viz stuff. This is why a lot of data viz is done in Canvas and not SVG, because Canvas can be hardware accelerated. SVG currently, I believe, can only be hardware accelerated in Firefox, but it is one of those other things you can vote up on the browser, feature support sites. So in general, you get good performance because it is so small, the file sizes are so tiny, and it's really not until you get to the point of having nearly thousands of objects, or you really need a lot of objects before you start seeing those performance hits in most cases. So for a lot of things that we're doing on the web, a lot of UI things, if you're animating icons, you probably don't have 1,000 pieces in that icon, you should be pretty okay. But for data viz, that's why a lot of people move to Canvas. So that wraps up our tour of the world of web animation. So hopefully the next time around you face this question, you'll be able to have a slightly better answer for it, or at least be more confident in your answer for it, know which thing to pick, which branch of it depends to go down to find your solution. If you like all this animation stuff, we talked about all the codes, not all the code stuff, but focus on a lot of code stuff today. I also wrote a book about the design side of it. It features many pictures of my dog. So I figured that was okay, never mind. Usually a selling feature. Yeah, but this covers more the design side of things, of how, once you figure out the technology that you're going to build the animation in, what should it look like, what things should accomplish, all of those things. Yeah, I also have a weekly newsletter. If you would like someone in your inbox every week to remind you how cool animation is, I will do that for you. And I'm always happy to talk about this stuff on Twitter. So thanks so much for listening.